All right. So I think it's fine. We are 7. Okay, so Carl started the recording. Um, Hello everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the TMB group. We have with us Gabriel Madirolas, who's a postdoc at the International Center for Neuroscience and Ethics by the Tatiana Foundation in Spain, and is presenting a research project from his PhD and now into his postdoc about the assumedly probabilistic nature, fundamentally probabilistic nature of reality or of nature. Gabriel, you have the floor.
Okay, so thank you very much, Robert, for the kind introduction. So, well, I couldn't be happier that it is you who is chairing me today. So I assume you still see my slides and you don't see my comments and all that, right?
All good.
Perfect. So, and of course, a big thank you to Dr. Preston. First, because for having replied to the email I sent showing all my questions, because believe me, it is few academics that have been so kind to reply to the challenge I sent. And second, thank you very much for inviting me to share my project with you today, with all you, and especially to give me the opportunity to hear the ideas and suggestions from this amazing group of people, which is actually the main point why I am talking to you today. So I would like to start by introducing myself and my career so far, because I think it is going to help you understand how this project came to be. So I am passionate about physics since I was a teenager. Okay, my dad was a physicist. That's my secret. So I studied theoretical physics at the Complutense University in Madrid. And there I learned the basics of well, what you learn in physics, mathematical modeling. But what I value the most is having learned to discriminate the relevant variables of the systems you want to study. After university, I wanted to understand complex systems, in particular those made out of interacting living beings. And I did a PhD on collective behavior with Gonzalo García de Polavieja at the Cajal Institute in Madrid and the Champalimaud Neuroscience Program in Lisbon, Portugal. Things I did there developed Bayesian models of how an individual integrates her personal information and the collective one. And I also use neural networks to find the optimal ways to aggregate the opinions from groups of experts. During my PhD, I developed an increasing interest in the cognitive processes underlying behavior. Therefore, I joined the lab of Alfonso Pérez Escudero at the Research Center of Animal Cognition here in Toulouse, in France. I first did a postdoc with him in the processing of environmental information in the nematode, in C. elegans, in foraging. And my last position was at the same institute with Mathieu Lioreau in his lab, where I was involved in projects about learning, navigation, communication in bees. And other of my big, long-time passions is philosophy, in particular of mind and of life, and of physics as well. And I have always wondered about the deep meaning of the topics I was studying. And I am actually very happy because during the last year, I developed a project with my supervisor, Mathieu Lioreau, and José Ignacio Murillo, who Robert knows very well, from the Mind-Brain group in the University of Navarra, where we explore the use of anthropomorphism to compare cognition across the animal kingdom, including insects. So in short, all my research has revolved around the question of how humans and animals as well understand the world and interact with it. And actually, I always ask myself questions that cannot be addressed from the specialized knowledge of a single discipline. And one of those questions is about the origin of probability in nature. in quantum physics, when two systems, for example, two particles, interact, one cannot predict where the particles will be detected after the interaction, only the probability to find the particle at each point of space. So this is usually, or the canonical interpretation is as if the particle was like a wave spread all over space. There are different interpretations, but this is the canonical one, the wave function. But the physicist Alfred Landé proposed an alternative, more natural explanation, not in 2015, because he was dead by then, is in the 60s of the previous century. So his explanation, which I really like, is that the result of interactions is the result of interaction, and in general the outcome of all elementary process is this that can only be predicted probabilistically. So it's the interaction, the moment of the interaction, what has an indeterminate component. So I long wondered if we can only understand these processes in a probabilistic way, and this is due to the basic processes being fundamentally probabilistic or undetermined. Could I extend this idea to explain the unpredictability of other levels of reality, like molecular biology with, for example, gene mutations, where, well, you cannot predict where, when, at which locus of the DNA, or that where they will happen. But also the evolution of many macroscopic physical systems like the atmosphere, or the decisions of living beings and how they affect the world in which they live. So my question is, if our understanding of the world and all the most accurate theories with which we try to describe it have a probabilistic component, what is the origin of our probabilistic cognition? Is it an ontological origin, like the one proposed by Alfred Landé for particle physics, but that I propose to extend to all natural processes? Are all natural processes probabilistic? Or is it an epistemic question, in the sense that knowledge about the world can only be probabilistic, independently of how the world is in itself, is our knowledge? Or could it even have an evolutionary origin, in the sense that it is an advantage for living beings to have a brain that evaluates probabilities about the world and that makes decisions in a probabilistic way? I know they are not exclusive. It's like different origins that may exist. I mean, mutually exclusive, they are not necessarily. So this is, in a sense, a philosophical question, of course, that requires a metaphysical study of the natural world and of the living beings that experience it. But I believe it is a question that can only be addressed from an interdisciplinary perspective, because it has implications both for how we process the world and for the evolution of the living systems in the world. So this is why, to explore how these ideas might be substantiated by quantitative studies, I am learning to implement networks that work probabilistically at the level of neurons or layers of neurons and communication between layers of regions. And I want that these networks help to understand the individual whose brain I am modeling, a brain that may have been selected through evolution, as I said, to work in this fully probabilistic way. Because I did not want to develop the classical multidisciplinary project where each discipline, in this case philosophy, computational and evolutionary biology, is aware of the results of the other. I wanted each one to be like an active and necessary element in the development of the others. Because as I said, what I ultimately aim for is an integrative, unified view of life and human being and its relation with the world. So I have been, as Robert said, extremely fortunate to have received a grant, a one-year grant actually, to launch this project. awarded by the International Center for Neuroscience and Ethics, the CINEP Center Institute of the Tatiana Foundation in Spain. And I had the privilege of being supervised by Paul-Antoine Miquel, who is a professor in philosophy of biology and of nature at the University Jean Jaurès here in Toulouse. He has deeply explored the question of the difference between a purely material system and one that makes a living being. Just material system and a system that is a living being. And to address the evolutionary component of this project, I keep interacting with my previous supervisor, Mathieu Liauraud, who is a top researcher on behavioral and cognitive ecology. So I'm going to discuss some of the topics I am investigating related to my project. But I am especially interested in knowing your opinions, or if you could share your knowledge about them. It's more about questions, this presentation. So some of the topics I will discuss may seem not directly related to the question of the origin of uncertainty. But as I said before, I think this question calls for a deep understanding of many fundamental concepts. I'm going to talk or discuss about indeterminacy, life, and free will, about representations and information, about Bayesian brains, and about cognitive artificial neural networks. So I'm going to start discussing what does it mean that the world is non-deterministic, especially what does it mean for living beings. I think it is good to clarify the difference between some related concepts. Indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is an ontological notion. Something is not determined if there is no reason for it to happen or to exist in a specific way. And this does not mean that it is not caused by other things, but that it could have happened in other way than the specific one it happened. Like, for example, the direction of one particle after being scattered by another, as I discussed before. So, and indeterminacy, ontological. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is an epistemological notion. We have no certainty about whether an event will happen or about how it will exactly happen. And this uncertainty can be caused because of indeterminacy or because we have lack of full knowledge of all the determinants, all the variables involved. Finally, for me, probabilistic is a model that explicitly uses probability distributions to describe what is the uncertainty that we have about something. Having clarified this, I want to discuss two aspects of indeterminacy that almost always come up in debates about free will. The first is motivated by all the probabilistic models of behavior and decision-making that I have worked with during my career. So behavior can be predicted, but not deterministically, but at least to follow probability distributions. These distributions are supposed to be the result of environmental conditions and of the cognitive operations of the deciding individuals. So all this raises a debate about a paradox, namely whether you can talk about a freely choosing individual when you can predict the distribution of answers in a group or in a population. So for example, you ask the attendants to a wedding dinner how many chocolates they want for dessert. Of course, there are many determinants, like how much food has each guest already have, or how much does each one like chocolate. So with these determinants, you can predict, with these variables, a probability distribution of how many chocolates will be ordered by the guests, by each one, by all the guests. On the other hand, each individual has the conviction that they have decided freely, even if they are conditioned, but they have decided freely the precise number that each one wanted. So the question to think about, how can you make compatible a predictable collective distribution of replies with the individual acts of freely choosing? So the second question I want to discuss is whether the laws of physics leave room to free will, a very old question. And the king of determinists was Laplace. And he famously argued that if some super intelligent demons are always super intelligent, I don't know why. So if this demon knew the positions and velocities, or momenta, if you want, of all the particles in the universe, he could know all their past and future positions. And of course, this does not leave any room to a free agent determining the course of events. But you may know that the modern theory of chaotic dynamical systems has shown that the evolution of systems cannot be predicted up to arbitrary precision. And as I discussed at the beginning, quantum mechanics entails an indeterminism. So some could say that here is where the determination from a free agent can act. If there is like fundamental indeterminism, maybe freedom, a free agent can determine the events. But then there are the reductionists that claim that everything that happens in the universe can be reduced and explained by the interactions of elementary particles, even if they are subject to indeterminacy. So reductionism, which denies free will by reducing everything to interactions between particles, in principle may sound quite evident, especially for physicists, for example. But it is not so evident if we consider how a living being is constituted, because we have to take into account what differentiates a living being from an inert, even if very complex, system, even a dynamical system. So a major feature of living beings is that they are organized in different levels. These levels are composed by elements that have structures and interactions unique of their own level. And here are the levels as defined by George Ellis. As you can see, the list goes all the way up from elementary particles through biomolecules, cells, organs, to the individuals and the world in which they live. And actually, this discussion that I'm presenting, this part is inspired by this paper. It's very well, it has a lot of inspiration from this paper. But the question is, do these levels, these ones, have a real existence, or are they just descriptive levels that we use to make sense of what we observe when we study the properties of life? So it is a question equivalent to that of the ontological or epistemic origin of indeterminacy. Because as I said in the introduction, I wonder whether each level of reality has an intrinsic component of indeterminacy generated by the own level that cannot be reduced or predicted only by the uncertainty or indeterminacy of lower levels. So if what I just said was true, maybe we could say that what determines the events of that level is caused by the structures and dynamics of that level, and is not reducible to causes coming from lower levels, the atoms, the molecules. So this is like saying that the decision to choose one chocolate is made by the individual, or at least by its nervous system as a whole, if you want, and cannot be explained only with the dynamics of the atoms that compose it. So moreover, as all the upper levels are composed of elements from lower levels, whatever event that is caused by the higher level has necessarily to influence the elements of the lower level. This is what is called downward causation. So that is to say that a free deciding individual can have causal power over the micro level, the atoms, the molecules, the cells, without violating the laws of physics. Okay, so because when we talk about decision making, we usually refer to individuals, to cognitive individuals, or at least to living beings. And to me, cognition stems actually from the fact that there is uncertainty. So the individual has to interpret the information it receives from the environment and use this interpretation to determine what to do next. For example, there are two paths that lead to the food. Okay, one of them is short, but it may be more dangerous. The other looks safer, but it is very long. So the truth is that this situation is uncertain for the deciding mouse. And which path will the individual take is undetermined before the decision. But on the other hand, I showed you that which direction will a particle be projected after interacting with another is not determined before the interaction happens. So in the case of the animal, we all say that the determination of the final direction is the product of a cognitive process. In the case of particles, it seems reasonable to think that the direction taken is just a random determination. But what about, for example, a bacterium that can navigate in one or other direction to arrive to the nutrients? When it finally turns left, this can be, for example, left, this can perfectly be seen as the result of very complex molecular and physiological mechanisms that are influenced by information received from the environment. So would you say that the determination of the direction taken in this case is the result of cognitive processes? Or would you say that it is just the result of atoms and molecules interacting? So the question for you is, when can we say that the determination of the direction taken has been the result of a cognitive process and not a purely random, so to say, determination? Does life imply cognition? Always. Does life always imply cognition? If not, at what level of complexity can we consider that a living organism is cognitive? Questions for you. So anyway, regardless of the origin of uncertainty, what is undeniable is that we have an experience of the world as uncertain. Even as I have discussed, our decision making has a degree of uncertainty. So the first question that a cognitive neuroscientist may ask is, how does the brain represent uncertainty? What neural mechanisms underlie our mental experience of an uncertain world? But you may realize that in the previous two sentences, I talked about two different kinds of representations. I said, how does the brain represent uncertainty? And I talked about our mental experience of uncertainty. The question I pose then is, what is a representation? And who is representing, the mind or the brain? And I'm going to resort to the definition that one of my heroes, Immanuel Kant, this is dedicated to you, Robert, gave of representation in the Critique of Reason. For him, representations are the inner determinations of our mind, which I think that in a modern language we could call a mental content. A representation is a mental content. And I think it is quite intuitive. We have mental contents, be them an image, a memory, a sensation, a thought, anything that comes to our mind as a distinct unity. But the question is, the fact that we have mental representations, does it mean that the brain has to represent as well? In other words, that means that a mental content has to correspond in the brain to something that you can identify as an entity. For example, a pattern of neural activity or of connectivity or of synapse strengths or all of them combined? For me, the assumption that this is the case, that the brain represents as well, is what I call the central dogma of cognitive neuroscience. And the dogma is, so in the brain as in the mind. Just because we have the almost undeniable experience of the mind having representations, does this mean that the brain has to somehow represent? But wait, mental representations or mental contents have semantic and syntactic properties. On the one hand, semantic properties because they stand for something and they mean something for the subject. They mean something. On the other hand, syntactic means that representations have compositional properties. You can combine them or make operations with them, usually following some rules or at least regularities. But the question again, is it proven that some of the brain features that I enumerated, neural activity, connectivity, have these properties? So I guess the assumption that this is the case is influenced by information theoretical approaches of cognition or computational theory of mind, which leads me to a question that I think is fundamental to elucidate for my project to make sense, at least to me. Is cognition information processing? So cognition is defined by many cognitive scientists as something like the activities and processes concerned with the acquisition, storage, retrieval, and processing of information. For example, this particular wording is by Richard Byrne in this reference below, where other authors give their vision as well of cognition. And I guess what they, when they define cognition like this, are implicitly assuming is the central dogma of cognitive neuroscience. So in the brain as in the mind, which you can also word as the mind is what the brain does, or at least the mental processing of information is implemented physically by the brain. But to start with, if you look at the etymology of the word cognition, you will find that it comes from the Latin verb cognoscere. That is, to get to know, become aware, to learn, to recognize. And this is for me what cognition is. It is about acquiring knowledge and being able to use that knowledge to know what we should do in the present or in the future. For example, a cognitive ability like memory is the ability to retrieve knowledge, not information, to retrieve knowledge to help us interpret a new situation and to know how to act based on what is similar in this situation to what we learned in the past. But moreover, to me, brains do not acquire and store information. Brains interpret information stored somewhere else and turn it into knowledge, or help to turn it into knowledge. Information is external. It is the possibility of acquiring knowledge contained or codified in a material support, like a book or the color of the clouds, which may inform you that it is going to rain. But okay, so on the other hand, I can see a counter-argument as follows. If we consider the brain only from the point of view of it as a physical organ with a function, organs have functions. So if the brain, we consider it as a physical organ with a function, maybe in this case, it makes sense to think of it as storing, processing information in the sense that it facilitates, it provides the physical support for the individual to learn something, to acquire knowledge. Okay, so a last remark about the relationship between information and uncertainty. Maybe you know that the technical definition, well, maybe not. for sure, you know that the technical definition given by Shannon of information is related to a reduction of uncertainty. A reduction of uncertainty that a message conveys to the receiver. For example, as you know, a yes or no answer to a question provides one bit of information. It reduces uncertainty. But this does not account for what this reduction of uncertainty means to the individual receiving the information. It is not as meaningful to receive a yes or no if I ask someone whether she likes dogs that if I ask her whether she will marry me. And this is discussed with this specific example in the awesome series of videos about free will by Peter Tse. These videos up there. And there is also promising work on the difference between syntactic and semantic information and about meaningful information. Okay, but I don't really have time to discuss this now. So I leave to you the question of whether the brain or the mind or both or none process information. And I'm going to assume for the following the language of brain representations. So then my question is, again, as I said, how does the brain represent or process uncertainty? And given that I'm talking to theoretical neurobiology people, I would love to take advantage and seek for some clarifications regarding the Bayesian brain in general and predictive coding in particular. Of course, I'm not going to review Bayesian brain for you, for sure. I wouldn't dare. But I'm going to summarize in few sentences my own interpretation of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. So the theory states that the brain represents or implements, if you prefer, a model of the world and use this model to interpret the events in the present, the things we experience in the present, and to predict future events. And this model is about probability distribution. Okay, it's about probabilistic distribution of the variables in the world and of the dependencies between those variables. And I like to think, in general, that a model of the world, be it a physical or biological model, describes invariants in the world, things that we have found to be always in the same state, or to evolve in the same way, in a predictable way, or about stable relationships between entities. So in the case of the Bayesian brain, these invariances are about the statistics in the world, and they mean low entropy distributions. So the model of the world is constructed with the hope that we assess a high probability to the things that actually have the biggest chance to happen. And this means that if the model is well constructed, most of the perceptions will be experienced. So most of the perceptions that we will experience in the future will be little informative. Okay, so with the formula of the information. Okay, so if it rains as it was highly expected, it provides low information. But if it's dry, it provides high information. So following the free energy principle, when a highly unexpected and therefore highly informative sensory perception happens, we update our model, making this perception more probable than with our old model. And this means that the next time that we experience the same perception, it will convey less information than the previous time we experienced it. It will be less surprising. And by the way, this is why I like to call the free energy principle the minimum surprise principle. But it's just my understanding of the thing. So the first question I would like to ask you in this section is about the notion of a model of the world. So it may sound a naive question, but I really need to understand. So can we consider that the brain has like one huge model of the world, okay, or that there are different models for different situations and tasks? Okay, in any of the two cases, how are the models stored in the brain? Or what are the mechanisms that allow this model to be represented or implemented, okay, when needed? So maybe, I don't know, I'm probably thinking about the concreteness of the model of the world. What we refer to when we talk about a model of the world, and what does it correspond to in the brain, if you want. And I am especially interested by models of the world that include abstract variables, because, okay, so the neural support of this scheme of model implementation and updating is very well studied in the case of sensory stimulus. But again, the question is how well studied is the case of more abstract cognitive abilities, okay, or activities. So question, do we know the neural implementation of the world model about these abstract variables? Do we even know what are the actual variables represented by the Bayesian brain in this case? If they are probabilities are distributions that variables follow. So what are the variables in this case when we are talking about abstract cognitive activities? So for example, a concrete example, if someone is speaking to you in English with a particular pace and intonation, and suddenly, without changing the acoustic and rhythmic characteristics of the speaking, starts to speak in español, entonces muchos de vosotros dejáis de comprender lo que estoy diciendo, a pesar de que las características físicas son iguales. Okay, sorry. What I was demonstrating is that the prediction that I have broken some seconds ago is not of a physical or sensory nature, but of an abstract semantic nature. You expected that the sounds that I emitted will continue corresponding to the English vocabulary and grammar, and from this fact, you almost automatically translated the sound arriving to you into meaningful concepts, or hopefully. So again, what is the model or the part of the model of the world that does not correspond to sensory input, but is about meaning, about relationships between abstract variables? Is the neural implementation of these models or part of the model understood? So I don't know if it's a naive question or impossible to answer, or you will tell me. And I wanted to ask two questions specifically about the predictive coding implementation of the free energy principle. The first one is about, again, abstract variables. I always abstracting, I don't know why. I know that for perceptual tasks, it is very well studied how the error is minimized across the hierarchy of microcolumns. But however, there are differences across different regions of the cortex in the width and the density of the 6 layers of neurons. And this granularity gradient actually is related to more or less superior regions of the brain, if you want, or of the cortex. So I wanted again to know whether the predictions and prediction errors in the areas of the brain associated with more abstract variables are supposed to be transmitted and processed in the same way as in the primary sensory areas. Okay, the same way as the microcolumns of the sensory areas. And second, if I don't know if I will explain correctly, if I understand correctly, the hierarchies of the Bayesian model of the world have a correspondence with the hierarchies of the regions of the brain. Or not? Is it correct? Actually, that's the question. Because if this was the case, then we could say something like the less abstract variables of the Bayesian model are represented in the lowest regions of the cortex hierarchies, and the more abstract variables are represented in the highest areas of the hierarchy. But I don't know if this localist interpretation is correct. Because on the other hand, if all the variables were represented at the same level, say highest levels or lowest, I don't know, I wonder why we would need a model of hidden variables, for example, of the world, when all we would need is to represent the probability distributions and dependencies of the sensations we expect to experience. Okay, so I'm all the time trying to figure out about there is or not a hierarchy of abstract and less abstract concepts or things like that. Well, you will tell me. So, as I said, last point, in the introduction, my project aims for an integrative approach. So I will end by discussing the computational implementation of some of the previous concepts and how I plan to relate it to the evolutionary aspect of my research. So my concrete result will be to test whether indeterminacy at all levels of computation of a neural network can be beneficial for the performance of the network. So artificial neural networks compute the probabilities that each of the possible outputs are the correct one. And the typical example is the probability that an image is of a cat, a dog, or a frog. But this does not mean that the networks work themselves probabilistically. Given a specific input, they always produce the same output. If they think an image is a picture of a dog, they are going to say the same each time you present the same picture to the network. So what I want to test is the advantages of having a network that produces a flexible response, that have a degree of indeterminacy in its behavior, if you want. And to obtain these flexible responses, I am designing networks that work probabilistically at all levels. For example, that have neurons with probabilistic activation functions, or when the communication between layers of neurons is noisy if you want, or probabilistic, or there is some randomness added to the output of the network. And the idea is to test what are the levels, if any, where the inclusion of indeterminacy is more beneficial. In the introduction, I pointed out that one of the origins of probabilistic cognition can be that it is selected through evolution. And actually, it has been very well studied that to have individuals that do not always respond in a deterministic way represents an adaptive advantage, because this guarantees that in front of an unexpected challenge, at least some individuals within the population will respond in a convenient way. So it's good for the species. And as a proof of concept that my results can help to explain the advantages of probabilistic cognition, I want to confront my networks with tasks inspired in cognitive experiments. These kind of tasks have already been designed, actually, for networks, I mean. For example, in this paper, they present a set of 20 cognitive tasks that depend, for example, on working memory or decision-making. And actually, in this other paper, they design a network using neuroevolution and other techniques. And this network is able not only to learn which is the color associated with a reward, but is able to learn without having to be trained again and very quickly when the rewarded and punished colors suddenly change. And this is called meta-learning, or learning to learn. And this is beautifully equivalent to the experiments that are performed in my lab with honeybees and bumblebees, by the way. So I hope that using these kind of tasks, my results will be more relevant for ethology and for evolutionary neuroscience. But I want that my networks themselves can provide insightful results to understand the brain and cognition in general. So I wanted to ask you guys whether you think it is possible, or will be possible in I don't know how many decades or centuries, to have a good simulation of how a brain actually works, even a simpler brain than ours, and how the brain is related to cognition. So the question is, do you think that we can or will be able to achieve biologically realistic models of the brain with the mathematical and computational tools that we have nowadays. Or we would need maybe, I don't know what you think, to come up with new types of mathematics and physics. Or even more, maybe, I don't know what you think, there will always be some aspects of the brain and cognition that will be impossible to be emulated. But if you think that at least some cognitive abilities can be replicated, do you know which algorithms and or architectures, network architectures could produce these, could emulate or replicate some cognitive abilities? And I will give an example of one feature that a cognitive neural network should have, in my opinion. So cognition is not living in the pure present. It involves temporal abilities like memory, as I discussed, and anticipation of the future. And I think this is in tune with the Bayesian brain framework, in the sense that a model of the world allows both to recreate the past and to anticipate the consequences of our actions. So I want my networks to have these abilities, and for this I will use what are called the long short-term memory, or LSTM cells. And these layers of neurons not only communicate with each other, but they are able to store the experiences that pass through them, or informations, if you want, that pass through them, in a way that the most relevant ones are stored for more time. And what is beautiful is that in this paper, it is proposed an equivalence between these LSTM cells and the canonical microcircuits of the cortex, the ones that implement the predictive coding. So I will study how to use these chains of LSTM cells to emulate a brain that is implementing and correcting a model of the world. But this is only one example of a feature that my networks could have. But I would love to hear what other characteristics you think they would need to be able to emulate cognition. So to conclude, I would like to tell you a couple of questions arising from my project that I would be very interested in studying. So I would love to explore the ethical consequences of the debate of determinism and free will. If everything an individual does is determined by what happens at the lowest physical levels, what sense does it make to talk about concepts like guilt or moral responsibility? And of course, so this has been debated a lot, but I would like to approach it from the point of view of uncertainty and indeterminacy and all that. And another extremely interesting topic that I could explore would be the relationship between uncertainty and consciousness. Well, okay, so I admit that in general, the origin of consciousness is one of the philosophical subjects I am more passionate about. So I will study, nevertheless, at many points in my life. So I know that my project is very ambitious. I know. Actually, in these past 10 months, I have been able little more than to lay its foundations. And unfortunately, my grant ends in December. But I really hope to be able to develop the project in more depth. Because in fact, what I would love is that it became the cornerstone of my future research. But okay, but I can't wait to hear your ideas and to stop talking myself. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Do I stop sharing?
Yeah, I mean, if not necessarily. I suggest everyone unmute themselves and give Gabriel a round of applause for his excellent presentation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so this was quite atypical for our TMB meetings, in as much as we are usually the ones posing questions to the authors that present something, but this time the role seems to be reversed.
Exactly.
Though I am not sure what there is any one single intelligent system on the planet, human or otherwise, that can respond to all the questions that you posed, as these are a canon for philosophy and science itself. So it is, your project might be millennial, like millenary. I will start by, well, asking a question. I will leave to Carl to give you answers. I can only ask further questions, so I cannot give anything more than that. I'm curious about how you think about this issue. So you distinguished in the beginning the way indeterminacy is an ontological notion and then uncertainty is more of an epistemological notion. And then at some point you connected them to the idea of information, to the formal theoretical apparatus of Shannon that is, of course, based on probability theory. And you have this superb statistical inference tools at our disposal nowadays. So a lot of people, and I'll give you a concrete example of someone that is working in fundamental physics and thinks the idea of uncertainty and the idea of entropy even being a purely observer relative notion, so being an epistemological notion. A few days ago, I met with Stephen Wolfram. I'm also research fellow, associate research fellow with the Wolfram Institute, and we discussed about how he views entropy and information as purely dependent on certain properties of observers. Of course, to get into the Wolframian picture, you have to understand many things from his intellectual tower, but the idea is that is not only him, but many other people that say that apparently information, if you take it to its limits, should be the epistemologically primary notion for understanding indeterminacy. So the direction of explanation or the direction of making things intelligible goes from epistemology to ontology rather than the other way around. So usually, as in quantum mechanics example that you gave, we postulate an inherent indeterminacy to explain the inevitable probability distribution, so probabilistic nature of any experiment that we might carve out. So if we use the notion of information, and in the sense of the Shannon information that is inherently probabilistic, is like fundamental questions posed to nature, as Wheeler said, it is inevitable that you will get answers that are probabilistic in nature. It's a probabilistic tool. So instead of going from ontology to epistemology, many people go from epistemology to ontology. So they say, given that information is this tool, and given that information is the cornerstone of, some people say even of physics, but of all science, and science itself might be just a mechanics, a very advanced mechanics of measurement, observing, measuring, recording, and storing, and then creating further representations, since you invoked my hero as well, Kant. So I'm curious whether you think, and of course, I don't even mention the active inference and under the free energy principle, where inevitably human agents like us operate under very temporally and factorially thick generative models, and we even share, we have federated learning, we correct our own errors and many recursive loops. So even in this framework, the nature of cognition, the nature of knowledge, the nature of science is cast as a statistical inference. So it's cast in terms of probability or degrees of uncertainty, degrees of plausibility. So it seems that there is a converging line of reasoning across many people working in fundamental problems in their fields or across fields as you do, that the epistemology of it, the information, with information at the forefront, seems to be the primary vehicle for understanding this aspect of nature. I'm curious what you make of this mini rant that I just gave you.
Okay. So the concrete question is?
The concrete question is whether you think information should, as a formal tool, makes the uncertainty as an epistemological notion primary over indeterminacy as an ontological notion.
You are very Kantian. Okay. I see. Because it's what in the end is what happens, because when we talk about ontology, we talk about things that we can only infer about, right? We can only.
That's why it seems almost a mistake for me to do ontology without doing epistemology first. It's not even, yeah, it's terrible without one without the other.
Exactly, we will only access it through the epistemology in the end. So, but the thing is more or less whether information is like a framework, like a global framework under which you can understand all the act of knowing, right? It's more or less something like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't not mean that information has any like ontological or fundamental value, right? Because information depends on the subject. In the end, I mean, a book is not as informative for me than for I don't know, a Chinese guy that doesn't know Spanish, for a dog, or for right? So information is very relative to each subject. A material thing or system does not have the same information even for two different individuals. Sometimes we agree in the meaning. So I think that's my. So I do not see it as fundamental in the sense that it is very individual dependent. It's a point, but nevertheless, I'm here to listen to your thoughts by the lab. So I prefer to listen to what other things about your question as well.
So maybe I'll add something later about this, and I'll give now the floor to anyone from the audience that wants to pop in and ask. So you, by all means, please do. See, just raise your hand, and if not, maybe while you collect your thoughts, I might push you a bit further with this. So,
yeah,
what is the paradigmatic notion of let's say objective, since you invoke that information is subjective? And one might say that even Shannon information, in the way people characterize it, and Shannon himself characterized it as being purely syntactic notion. And well, he left semantics aside for many reasons. But people were saying, and in the literature, one of them being Peter Tse, which you invoked, I recently reviewed a paper of his, and he said that Shannon's notion is primarily epistemological. And what I replied in the review to Dr. Tse was that, look, what is then the primary ontological, if you want, notion of information or of entropy as its cognate notion? It will be probably the one used in statistical mechanics, so let's say Boltzmann entropy. Well, but one of the fundamental results in the mid-century of the 20th century that connects information theory with statistical mechanics was Jane's proof that you can derive Boltzmann entropy under certain conditions, certain constraints. You can derive it from Shannon entropy. So what's the move here? The move is that you get from supposedly purely epistemological notion, which in retrospect might seem to be a sort of category mistake to say this, a hardcore ontological notion of entropy and information by inference, by extension. So you see, it's very difficult to tease apart what's the limit of our constitution as observers, as agents, as cognizers, as the way our brains might work, as the way information flow must be, or the geometry of information in our brains, or the realized by our brains is, from whether a deep nominal, to speak Kantianly, a deeply nominal reality behind that, like how that nominal reality is. And this is ultimately one of the points of the free energy principle. You are an active inference. You are always world casting. You are world modeling. You are enacting, casting, modeling, creating, holographizing, if you want, a world, because you can never know what's the deep cause of your sensations. You must infer it. So you have to reverse. That's why it's the generative model. You reverse the inference. So still, information might be semantic, might be subjective in the way you said, but there are, I would say, more considerations that support the hypothesis that it will be more profitable to think of information as a purely, or as the primary epistemological vehicle, and it would be, even though it's subjective in a sense that I agree with you, it's probably subjective due to the fact that we are using information as an umbrella term. So it's such a big notion, and it doesn't have a clear, well-behaved definition in all contexts. So what we did now in our exchange right now, my Shannon invocation of information was probably picked up by you, and you thought, okay, this is a subjective nature, it's a subjective notion, it depends on the observer, and yeah, that's true. But at some point, it will be subjective in a very similar way across different classes of similar observers. So I think this is where objectivity as an universal, or like observer-specific intersubjectivity, can be meaningfully posed. Sorry, I don't want to give any answers to your questions, just engaging in conversations.
Loved it.
All right.
Is so going to say something?
I'm not sure whether anyone has any other question or like you want to answer.
Yes, finally.
All right. So Jerry Nevis. Jerry. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. Yeah, fascinating speech. You know, and I don't know that I have any answers, but I think we're all coming from multidisciplinary backgrounds, and so mine being more marketing related. And so anytime I see anything like when you're talking about purchase of chocolates or something, I'm like, oh, it might be something I can actually talk about in this room. So one thing I might at least throw your way from a marketing perspective is one of the distributions from Ehrenberg is the idea that purchase probabilities follow a negative binomial Dirichlet. And there's some research out there around it, if it's helpful at all, because as Robert said, you're asking really big questions that I think we're all grappling with, like, how does this work, you know? I think the other thing that I know I'm thinking about from my perspective is embodied, inactive, extended cognition when it comes to this, and like how the environment itself shapes the way that we interact with the world and the decisions that we make. You know, so I throw that out there just so that you've got some conversation, and curious if that's anything that is in your work or anything that you've been thinking about. I don't, you know, pretend to have any answers to any of these things any more than anybody else in the room would. I think, like you said, it's definitely, you know, where we're on the edge of things trying to figure this out.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I mean, for sure, I really. So one part of the project is the evolutionary implications of the way we process the information uncertainty or deal with it. So what could be more 4E, like more embodied and active? I don't know what the 4E's are, but so it's absolutely for sure. It does make no sense at all if it's not thinking about how it is embedded in the world. So I don't know if it makes sense or not, but
no, it does. Like I said, it's just something I'm grappling with. The main thing I want to do is just throw out at least that negative binomial Dirichlet in terms of consumer behavior, if it's of any interest to you. Just because it's something that we're trying to explain in our world, and that's why I'm here, is to try and figure out how that, you know, might eventually tie together.
Okay, I will. I don't know about it, so I will look it up. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and yeah, it's Ehrenberg is and it's from like the 60s, but it's still something that's talked about today in terms of decision making within marketing, at least in human behavior.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Jerry. So Andrew Levi, as a raise hand. Right. You're muted, Andrew.
muted and we don't see you.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry,
Oh.
my computer had a little pause there.
No.
Yeah, I just wanted just a bit more of a kind of general clarification there. So the talk, you've kind of labeled it as like, is nature probabilistic? So are you trying to come at it from like, is this the laws of nature? Are they inherently probabilistic? Or because it seems you're more kind of dealing with minds and cognition. So is it more that like we have, some level of ambiguity, our minds are embedded in a Markov blanket, and therefore that makes the nature of the mind probabilistic? Or you're more appealing to this kind of the whole nature of the the universe essentially is probabilistic, which is kind of the thing you're trying to argue or explore?
Yeah, I know that there is this ambiguity. I mean, when I gave this talk in my lab, I got the same question. So to start with, so actually one question is, because you remember that I showed these three possible origins of uncertainty or probabilistic or whatever, and I say that they are not mutually exclusive. Okay, so for sure, I mean, well, as Kantians we are, we don't know how the world is in itself. When I say it's an ontological origin, meaning that then we will never actually know fully what is the origin, but nevertheless, so, but my question is, yeah, maybe I'm just rewording what I said in the presentation, but of course, if all levels are fundamentally indeterminate, okay, we conceptualize as probabilistic, or we analyze them. This applies both to the world outside and to the world inside, to the brain as well. But anyway, so I always wonder what is more, what does more, what weights more in this, because in the end it's our experience. Experience goes first. We have the experience of uncertainty. So what is more, a more powerful reason, the uncertainty of the nature of the world, or the uncertainty coming from our limitations, so to say? I mean, what we cannot know with perfect accuracy of the world, and if it's more than our own limitations, where do these limitations come from? From the fact that we are actually made out of physical entities, atoms, etc., and therefore, if nature is fundamentally probabilistic, they are as well, or the fact that for some reason you cannot like assemble a brain or a brain-mind system or whatever able to perfectly know the world, or even if you were able to assemble this system, it wouldn't be as beneficial because we come from a single cell through evolution. So maybe it wouldn't be as beneficial as having more uncertainty at the cognitive level, or randomness at the physiological level, if you want. So I don't know if I clarified, but as you can see, I
think, if from my understanding, you're arguing, well, not arguing more, but you're kind of appealing more to the sense that we exist within a Markov blanket, then we're inherently, I always forget the correct philosophical terms, but like I think we're like epistemologically idealists, I think might be the right way to put it. Or
Transcendental
like,
idealist, you mean to say?
Maybe I'm not sure. I'm not a philosopher, but yeah, I think perhaps it sounds like you're appealing more to the fact that we're inherently closed off to reality, and therefore the complexity makes us inherently ambiguous to the causes. Right? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, maybe yes. Actually, I'm very interested to know whether our uncertainty, like in our brains, is tuned to the uncertainty of the outside world. I mean, how is it tuned? Is so to say in purpose? So we, like the elements of the brain are assembled in a way that can be tuned to the uncertainty outside, or is it something like that grew more like in parallel, like everything being undeterministic and being like feedback loop, maybe through the Markov blanket? I'm not very much. I don't know very much about the theory. I understand the basics, but it's something like that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, another thing that comes to mind as well is on your notions of free will. And again, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm talking way out of my level of experience here. But I remember Daniel Dennett talking on the notions of free will, and I think what he was essentially appealing to, and I think perhaps wrongly so, was the fact that the number of degrees of freedom at our disposal at any given moment kind of gives, us free will. And I think people just argued back, no, that is why the illusion of free will is so strong, because it feels like we've got so many degrees of freedom, even though we always settle on one decision in a moment. So there might be something interesting within that. And another kind of theory or kind of perspective that's come to mind is also the work of David Deutsch. I don't know if you're familiar with his stuff on like constructor theory. So that's what, if you were going to kind of go down the route that like, nature is fundamentally, probabilistic, obviously he's appealing to the fact that it isn't. And the fact that actually, the fundamental laws of nature are more based on possibility than probability. And so, it's the fact that, like, again, this is not my experience, but like in terms of like with quantum theory, you can settle some of the probabilistic elements with the many worlds interpretation, and you can develop a constructor theory. The idea is that like these are the things that are possible with any given set, and that's what puts the kind of limitations on within a given set of environments or needs. What we're going to be able to perceive or kind of what transformations can occur within that kind of universe. So I was just thinking, like, if you're trying to appeal to, is nature fundamentally probabilistic? It might be useful to look at his work where he's arguing to the opposite of that.
Okay, but so I don't know if I understand well. So because possible in what sense? Because in the end, probability is you assess the probability of each of the possible states in which you will find a system, right? So probability is like a quantification of the possibilities, and regardless of your interpretation of probability, frequentist or whatever, or Bayesian, I mean, what is the probability you expect to find the world for each of the possible states you expect to find? So I don't understand if probabilistic and this possible states thing are like opposed, or
Yeah, I mean, it's been years since I read any of this, but basically he was coming from it sounds like quite a similar starting point as Wolfram, where the fundamental kind of building block of the universe is information, and essentially what the fundamental things we can say about information is what can be done to it, what are the transformations that can be applied to it. So what are the things that are possible to do to information and what are not possible to do information. And from that, the laws of nature, thermodynamics can fall out of it. And because the starting point isn't inherently probabilistic, it's therefore, it's us that is imparting the nature of probability on it, not the laws of nature itself. I think is a fair assertion, but again, this is me. I mean, it's been probably about 5 years since I read any of his books on this. Yeah.
So that would imply, for example, the interpretation of quantum mechanics would be like information, like a wave function, like conveying the information, right, that we have about the
exactly. Yeah. And like I said, I think he appeals to that many worlds interpretation, right, which means that everything is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, many words sounds more mystical to me, but yes. But I like, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, for me, in the end, you are always codifying the information or knowledge that you have about the state of the world. And if I say now I'm making it up, but if I say that information is something external, I mean, you have to codify to be able to understand it. But if it's external, that makes sense. I mean, from the point of view of what you say. And I am also interested in the degrees of freedom thing that you mentioned. I will look this up because I would like, I'm curious whether I can be relate that to my different levels or the George Ellis thing that I discussed about the levels of biological systems. I don't know if it has something to do about these levels, like levels of even cognition, if you consider like a bacterium can be somehow cognitive or not. So I'm very interested in this concept. Yeah, thanks a lot.
No, thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, if not, I think it's Carl's turn now for questions and answers. So
So it's my turn now, is it?
it seems so, Carl. Yes.
Hello, thanks.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Wonderful talk, and as usual, excellent discussion afterwards. I couldn't work out whether they were asking you questions or whether they were trying to supply answers in the form of questions. But it was a very rich discussion afterwards and a very rich talk, which had so much in it. It's going to be impossible for me to summarize everything, but I'm going to just pick up on some key themes, specifically from the perspective of the physics of things, which from which a lot of your, I think, arguments inherit. So I'm not going to have any philosophical finesse, but just to identify some key aspects of the physics of belief updating and measurement or observation that speak to your project. I've also got an eye on some of your later questions about if you wanted to develop this project, what kind of belief updating or what kind of physics would you bring to the table to explore some of the notions. So forgive me, I'm going to be polemic. I'm going to speak quickly because I imagine you're getting quite tired now, but I am mindful this is being recorded, so I'm hoping you'll be able to go back and listen to that conversation and all the suggestions, and also my stream of consciousness. So what I normally do is pick up on important points during the presentation and try to find related papers, usually in the free energy principle or active inference sphere, that speak to some of the key points that you can potentially follow up either to substantiate or to provide a complementary perspective on some of the points that you were making. You can sometimes there will be answers to some of the questions. Some of your questions I think had very clear answers. Sometimes it's more a question of, another way of looking at this is in terms of, and then just saying, this is a complementary perspective which usually reaches the same conclusion. So if you'll indulge me, I'll now. Can you just reverse your slides? Did you actually have a list of questions? I'm sure you had three sort of summary, didn't you? Could you go backwards on your slides?
I had. I'm still sharing, right?
You are still sharing. If you just reverse.
You mean that, like in the?
Oh no, perhaps the future prospects one was the what I was thinking about. I can try and remember most of the other ones, but
well, I had the overview because this is things.
Ethical based conscious. I see. Okay, no, fine. Okay, then that's super. Yeah, so your questions are more detailed as presented verbally. Perfect. Okay, I'm now going to try and share my screen. Just to remind me of the things that I wanted to say while you were talking.
Okay, I stopped sharing. Back.
Okay.
I stopped sharing.
Right, I'm now sharing. Does that work? Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Excellent. So I was just intrigued by the latter part of the conversation about the possibility of appealing to E.T. Jaynes and his formulation of observation and measurement in physics. And just to note that there are people, specifically this mathematician here from Stony Brook in America, Dalton, who has written a number of papers establishing that the free energy principle is dual to the maximum entropy principle. When you move to a path integral formulation of the free energy principle, that becomes equivalent or is dual to the maximum caliber principle of Jaynes. And I think that's quite an important observation if you now read Jaynes as writing down or articulating the physics of what it is to measure and to observe. In terms of information theory or probability theory. So I thought that was an important contact. I put this paper up because this is Dalton tends to preprint his stuff, but I'm hoping that this sort of summary by Maxwell Ramstead includes Dalton's key observation about the equivalence.
Yep. Thanks.
Good. Just coming right back to both the beginning and the end of the conversation, where Robert was discussing things from a philosophical perspective in terms of which comes first, ontology or epistemology, and then Andrew talking about sort of constructor theory. I found one way I was intrigued by putting the way that we make sense of our observations as written by a physicist was Carlo Rovelli's Helgoland. Have you read this one?
No, it's waiting for me in the shelves.
Excellent. Right. I did notice you'd cited Carlo for another reason. I didn't realize he'd written in that space. But I've read this, and it's popular. It's very short, but it would speak immediately to, I think, that sort of key debate that you were having. Some of the questions you were asking, and also the key debate you were having with Robert, and would be answered here through the lens of quantum theory, not necessarily quantum information theory, but from more relational quantum theory, where it is the whole physics, all of physics, can be read as quintessentially metrological. And that's quite an old classical physicist position, but I thought was very elegantly rehearsed from the point of view of quantum physics by Carlo, from the point of view of relational quantum mechanics, where effectively he's dissolving a lot of the sort of the paradoxes and debates simply by realizing that there's Bob, Alice, and someone else observing Bob and Alice, and it's once you realize that the observer is itself a system that can be in various states, a lot of the apparent paradoxes just dissolve, and all the debates about many worlds and all that good stuff in entertaining stuff largely goes away once you take this sort of measurement perspective, this relational perspective. It is just how I measure or observe something in relation to something else, and me as the observer now becomes part of a three-way I was going to say sort of entanglement, but that would be overusing quantum entanglement. So I just found that really useful. It's written in a popular style. There's no maths in it, but I found the ideas very revealing.
I know other books. I read other books by Carlo, and he's amazing. On telling all the concepts in a way that everybody can understand. Yes.
Yeah. Good. So that's that. I'll just a little plug for his. And in many senses, I would imagine telling the same kind of story that Stephen Wolfram was imparting to Robert. But one of the advantages, I think, of sticking with people like Rovelli is that this story is told against the backdrop of standard mathematical physics. You don't need to have a Wolfram Tower You don't need to commit to a whole set of neologisms and all of these arguments are just straightforward mathematical physics and can be easily related to sort of physics as we know and love it, which may or may not be a good thing from the point of view of truth pointing, but it certainly is a good thing from the point of view of being able to talk about these things and communicate ideas in reference to what people will have done at school or university. So that's that one. Here's mine. And I put this up unashamedly because I think it holds a lot of sort of key issues that speak to some of your questions. There are lots of issues here in this very long 100-page almost paper, which again is written as if one was a physicist, but trying to understand the emergence of measurement and sentience in certain kinds of systems, but standing right back and asking some fundamental questions. And one of the fundamental questions that this paper asks is, let's just take that out. One of the key questions this paper starts with before it develops the free energy principle in the second half is just to ask the question, when people talk about state spaces or I'm just trying to remember what the Ruliad or the support of a wave function, just asking what is the space or what is the nature of a state in a phase, in the sense of a phase space. And the answer offered in this treatment, I repeat, before one gets to the free energy principle, or indeed before one gets to quantum mechanics or thermodynamics and Boltzmann distributions, is that there is necessarily a scale invariance that one inherits just from the definition of a state, when in the following sort of narrative sense that if you say there is a state of what? Oh, of something. What kind of thing? Well, perhaps a particle. Oh, so I see. So a state is a state of a particle. What's a particle? Oh, well, a particle is comprised of a collection of states. But you just said a state is a state of a particle. And you can resolve that, if you like, circularity by applying the renormalization group. And I introduced that because, so what you're now saying is a state is a state of a particle, and it is those states of a particle that can be seen or measured, and that's the Markov blanket from the point of view of this paper. And then a particle now is a collection of these states at the next level up. And then at the next level up, you then have a partition into things or particles that are composed of states, where the states are inherent from the particles at the scale below. So if you commit to the question, what is a state, and follow that through in relation to the thing that has the attribute of a state must be some entity, in this paper, a particle, hence particular physics, then you necessarily end up with the kind of recursive definition that implies a scale invariance. And I mention that because this is exactly what George Ellis, one of your heroes, so you got, I imagine that you and Robert like Kant and George Ellis. So all of George Ellis's stuff rests upon bottom-up and top-down causation between different scales. So what this, the first part of this treatment says, any universe that is equipped or can be described as having states must have this scale invariant aspect to it. And as such, you can now talk about how the different scales are linked, and therefore all of your description of this universe must be in terms of bottom-up and top-down causation. And that, I think, is absolutely key to these kinds of questions, in the following sense that as you move up through the scales, and you just look at the mechanics of, say, using the apparatus of the renormalization group, of this definition of states of things or particles, what one sees is that the random fluctuations become progressively averaged away. So not only do you get an increase in the space and the time scale, but this becomes equipped with a successive reduction in the random fluctuations from the point of view of classical physics, which means that scale matters. And I say that because of your nice diagram with the molecule doing its interactions with some refractory surface and then going off in an indeterminate number of directions, versus the E. coli deciding to whether ascend this concentration gradient or that concentration gradient. From my point of view, that's a really important observation. And the thing that distinguishes the photon or the particle, small particle, from the bacterium is just the size. And because it is bigger, it now has the random fluctuations are suppressed, which means that the dissipative parts of its dynamics are now almost absent, and it behaves as a classical object. It behaves as if it is has a Lagrangian appropriate for classical mechanics. Whereas a small particle, the contribution, well, I should let me first of all just try to give you a bit of an iconic representation of what I'm trying to say here, and I'm going to have to go to sort of but basically what we're saying is that if you don't have to start here, but this is where the classical this particular physics starts, and where I start, and this is the only way I understand things, is just starting from a random dynamical system, say a Langevin equation, and saying that the only physics that matters is the probability density dynamics. It's a density dynamic. So this would, in answer to your question, is physics probabilistic? I would say absolutely. The only interesting dynamic is the density dynamics. And then we go to my hero, who is Helmholtz, to divide that into conservative and dissipative dynamics, cartooned here in terms of the flow, down the plug hole and around the plug hole. And then just asking, well, given this Helmholtz decomposition of any dynamics for any system that possesses a non-equilibrium steady state or a random dynamical attractor, what would happen if you looked at limiting cases that are very big and very small? So when things get very, very big, the dissipative part of the dynamics disappears, and you end up purely with the solenoidal part, which is just classical or Lagrangian mechanics. So, for example, Newton's laws. In contrast, at the other end of the scale, when you go very, very small, you can ignore the conservative part because the random fluctuations are very, very large. And then you get effectively statistical mechanics, more specifically fluctuation dissipation theorems from exactly the same construct. If you want to get Boltzmann distributions and thermodynamics and the full range of fluctuation dissipation theorems, you have to make an additional assumption. And I'm introducing this just because of your conversation with Jerry about and your example of asking a population what they would think. You've made an assumption that all the members of that population are somehow exchangeable. So you've got a canonical microensemble, which you don't have to make. It's quite a strong assumption. It's made by statistical and stochastic thermodynamics. And if you do make it, you can now derive fluctuation dissipation theorems and apply those, I would imagine, to how many chocolates I expect to have at the wedding, or voting population in population dynamics, because you've got an ensemble. But notice you don't have to make that assumption, and quantum mechanics doesn't make that assumption, and classical mechanics doesn't. There isn't an ensemble of heavenly bodies or moons. There's just one that shows solenoidal dynamics or classical Lagrangian mechanics. But if you relax the ensemble assumption and then just take the complex square root of that probability density, then you get to the time-independent Schrodinger equation. And from that, you can do all quantum electrodynamics and everything from exactly the same starting point, but only at a very small scale. So I think the answer to your question, is the universe probabilistic, or more specifically, is physics the dynamics of probability distributions? The answer is yes. Does that explain everything? Well, yes, it does, but you've got to take care about what scale you're applying this kind of probabilistic mechanics to, because you can get very different results depending upon whether you're very, very big and conservative in your dynamics and behave classically like heavenly bodies or bacteria moving through. Well, perhaps you have to be slightly bigger than bacteria. I'm mindful of Einstein's pollen grains on, when you get sort of too small, your random fluctuations start to creep back again. But say certainly the size of a mouse, and you and me, then we can be basically classical. And you can have the deterministic chaos in these classical systems. So this solenoidal part almost inevitably produces indeterminism in the sense of deterministic chaos. So lifelike systems, living systems, who almost exclusively can be described in terms of this conservative dynamics with the right kind of breaking of detailed balance, right nonlinearities, inevitably means that any living classical thing has to have solenoidal aspects, whether it's biorhythms, whether it's oscillations in my brain, whether it's heartbeats, whether it's walking and talking, whether it's a sleep-wake cycle, right the way through to replication and reproduction. It has to have this solenoidal aspect to it at every scale that encompasses the right kind of size of thing it is. And as soon as you say that, you're immediately in the world of deterministic chaos. And of course, then you've got the opportunity for talking about free will, simply by being biological or a biotic thing, you are necessarily manifesting yourself in terms of conservative dynamics with this itinerant solenoidal flow that almost invariably is chaotic. So I think all biological things make choices. I'm not so sure about small things, but certainly on the way that you were describing choices or free will, I think it would be an inevitable property of sort of intermediate scale things. The question now is, does the moon make a choice when it's doing its quasi-periodic orbit? Because is that chaotic or not? If it's chaotic, they may be making a choice. But I think there's a deeper reason, which we'll come to in a second, why the moon doesn't make a choice, whereas things like you and I do, and it all comes down to the size again. Just one little final twist here. The free energy principle is exactly the same as these things. It's just that you're breaking the states of the system X into the internal states and their active states, and then once you've done that, you can read the internal states as the sufficient statistics or the parameters of beliefs about external states, but the maths is identical. So the free energy principle effectively is a variational principle of least action that is purely equipped with the additional observation that the states that we're talking about play the role of sufficient statistics, like say mean and variance, of some probability distribution over something else. So it's over external states. And from my point of view, that's a really important observation, which I think goes beyond Shannon and indeed the arguments about connecting classical mechanics with probability distributions in the sense of James. So in the free energy principle, the beliefs encoded by internal states are about external states. They now have a meaning that is not intrinsic to the states that are encoding them. And that's what emerges from the free energy principle. So the information theoretic treatment of the internal states would be the kind of thing that you might do if you were measuring electrophysiological recordings and recording the entropy of the electrophysiological fluctuations in the brain, for example. And that would have an information theory. You could write down entropies and talk about the Shannon information and information flow. That's not the information, though, in the free energy principle, because the state of the neuronal system is actually encoding a probability distribution over external states that have meaning, like my wife, or getting married, or chocolate, or whatever is out there that under my generative model, I'm trying to explain my measurements, me as an observer of these sensory impressions on the sensory sector on my Markov blanket. So I think that's another key issue when people talk about sort of information and meaning and semantics. I would submit that you can certainly use Shannon information theory, but you don't apply it to the density dynamics of the thing that's observing. You apply it to the Bayesian beliefs or probability distributions encoded by the thing you're observing, because the thing you're observing is actually measuring or observing something else, and that's what the beliefs are about. It's a bit of a subtle one, but I think important from your point of view, or it may not be. You can judge. Let's get rid of that now we've done that. Just to race ahead to well, let's not. We'll come back to it just for a bit of fun. So this is a foundational paper from my point of view, which was meant to be written as an MIT book, but it was considered too mathematical by the publisher, and then he retired. And his name was he was Bob Pryor, and he used to be very pleased because he thought he had the publishing rights to anything about that was Bayesian, because his name was Pryor, and he used to tell. He used to have some great jokes. In the beginning were Pryors, and Pryors were good. So, but unfortunately, he retired. So this has never been published, but it's there on archives for people to go and look at. I just wanted to show you this thing because just for fun, because it's a completely empirical table. You had 8 scales or 8 levels. If I remember properly, that was inspired by George Ellis's discussion of different scales. We have this table here, which has 7 levels, but they speak exactly to the same kind of scaling that you were talking about. At the sort of not quite molecular, but sort of the level of sort of small spines on a nerve cell, through to a little mini column, through to a hypercolumn, through to an organ in the brain, through to a person, through to a dinner party, through to an international conference, a little community, and each having their characteristic spatial scale and temporal scale as an illustration of what would emerge, I was going to say supervene, but I have to be careful when talking to philosophers. As each scale supervenes on the level below. The interesting thing that these 7 levels, with their accompanying spatial and temporal scales, were not drawn up on the basis of knowing my world, but inherited from an analysis of fluctuations in the brain by applying the renormalization group that I just spoke about. So by empirically partitioning the brain and coarse graining it using blocking transformations inspired by the renormalization group, you can look at the spatial and time scaling laws. Technically, I don't know if you've come across them, they're called RG flows, which basically tell you, how much does time dilate as you ascend or descend scales, and what's the spatial scaling as you move from one scale to the next. You can estimate these things empirically from any given system that you can coarse grain over 2 or 3 or 4 different scales, and then you can extrapolate out what would happen if you were looking at a brain that was a kilometer in diameter, what would happen if you were looking at a brain that was, you know, a nanometer? And those numbers and that sort of different orders of different sort of scale actually came from an analysis of, in this instance, functional magnetic resonance imaging data from a human being, using this renormalization group and the scale-free analysis of the kind that George Ellis has been celebrating, and that emerges from the definition of states of a particle being the eigenfunctions of the Markov blanket or boundary states. So yeah, so this paper, which is otherwise completely useless, but you know, if you're interested in skill-free approaches of an empirical sort, was in a special collection. I thought, yeah, network neuroscience, parcels and particles, Markov blankets in the brain. But it's not so much about Markov blankets, but really the sort of the bottom-up and top-down causation between different scales. So that was interesting. The other perspective I think you should at least nod to in your writings or possibly future research, but I think it's a complement to George's notion of top-down and bottom-up causation. Once you've got this sort of scale invariance, which I read as, you know, an example of the renormalization group in play, is the physics introduced by Hermann Haken, which is, you know, another way, I think, of looking at the coupling between scales. So Hermann Haken was famous for basically introducing a theory of self-organization that transcends scales, initially working with sort of Ginzburg-Landau-like systems, and indeed Landau himself, or was it Ginzburg? I can't remember, but in laser physics. And the way that he would, or the way that synergetics would describe top-down causation and bottom-up causation would be in a slightly less slightly less narrative form and probably in a slightly simpler form. So he would describe this in terms of what's called the slaving principle, or the end slaving principle in physics, where the macroscopic modes, and these are effectively the what I was describing before, the eigenfunctions of the Markov blanket at the higher scale, now enslave in the sense of providing a low-dimensional manifold for faster fluctuations at the lower scale. But the circular causality implicit in top-down and bottom-up causation working hand in hand is actually a centerpiece of synergetics. They talk about circular causality, whereby you get the slaving principle, where the macroscopic modes, sometimes called order parameters of a system, enslave the microscopic, the scale below, dynamics or variables. And the way that you complete that circular causality is to note that the macroscopic behavior inherits from the microscopic fluctuations simply by taking some appropriate average, usually an eigenfunction or an eigenmixture of the microscopic modes of behavior or variables of behavior, which is just another way of sort of coarse graining. It's just summarizing. And you use the word relevant at the beginning of your talk in a technical sense. It is this, in synergetics, the relevant variables would be the order parameters that survive as you move from the microscopic to the macroscopic scale. So in that sense, the bottom-up causation is really identifying the relevant variables that exist, which are mixtures of microscopic variables. That perspective has very close connections with something called the center manifold theorem. And this is just a dynamical systems theorem where you basically, for most systems, you can think of it as slow dynamics tracing over some center manifold in some phase space, equipped with fast random fluctuations. But as soon as you leave the manifold, you'll pull back onto it again. and and knowing that there's this separation between slow dynamics on the center manifold and fast dynamics that play around the center manifold means you can apply things like the adiabatic approximation and have a separation into fast and slow, and then you can, for example, and certainly what is done in many instances, is just to call the fast stuff random fluctuations and the slow stuff the relevant variables, and then you get back to a Langevin or a random dynamical system. So I just put this up as a sort of mathematical perspective or complement to a narrative in terms of bottom-up and top-down causation that you can actually write down and simulate in a computer program. Indeed, as as people like Herman Haken have. But you can read about that in terms of entropy and degrees of freedom and the like. So I thought that might be a useful complement, which George may have written about. I don't know. I'm just more familiar with his more recent work in a sort of biological-like setting or a philosophical setting, but he may well have joined the dots himself in relation to that. Yeah. Oh, well, okay. I'll just mention why I put this up and explain it. So I was saying before that there is a bright line between the information geometries and inherent treatments, the information theoretic treatments of the states of you and me as observers or measurement inference machines trying to make sense of our sensed world. And the beliefs, the information geometry of the beliefs that are encoded by the sufficient statistics that are the my states. So my states, my brain states, stand in for the sufficient statistics of beliefs, probabilistic beliefs about the outside. So what that means is for one particular physically realized conservative process with possibly deterministic chaos or possibly even stochastic chaos, like my brain, there are two information geometries, one of which pertains to the actual internal states, the probability of being in this neural state or that neural state, and so density dynamics, and we measure that in brain imaging all the time. And that's the kind of information geometry that things like IIT would concern itself, and all the variance and complexity theory would concern itself with. That's, if you like, the thermodynamic sort of take on a brain. But there's another information geometry that is in the space of beliefs. When you read a belief as a probability distribution encoded by one state about another state, namely the external states or the causes of my sensory input. And that information geometry inherits from exactly the same physical realization, but it's now a belief, it's an information geometry about something. So I put this paper up as one answer to one of your questions about how do you talk about the meaning of the informational meaning versus the informational content. One way of doing that is just to say they're both in play. There's an information geometry about the states of this large thing, the classical states of this large thing. And there's another information geometry that inherits from the fact that the states of this large thing can now be read as the sufficient statistics of beliefs about something else, the outside. And that is the free energy principle. It's basically saying you are licensed to make this interpretation almost by construction. There is always this interpretation should you want to make it. So this paper just takes you by the hand as it was in entropy, I was going to say, and just takes you through this approach to repairing Cartesian dualism in the space of information geometries that have a dual aspect. One of them being about the meaning of stuff, and the other one being about the behavior, the dynamics of the thing that encodes or represents the beliefs about it. So that was why I put that up, and we can use that one. Oh, no, that's the same one. That's good. And oh, that's just advice where to look for the next trick. But let me just my apologies. I'm trying to well, no, okay. Let me very quickly come to this paper, which I think you will like, because it really again speaks to different kinds of things. So clearly, your small particle that interacts and then goes off in many different directions has a different look and feel from the mouse, from a bacterium, which can tumble down this concentration or that concentration. And I would submit that has a very different look and feel from you and me that actually think about the future and decide to do this or to do that. And in deciding or selecting among a number of counterfactual futures, I think then you can't get away from free will. And if you're saying that the way that you work is now to select amongst the a number of paths into the future, and thereby commit to the most likely path given the kind of thing you are, then that act of selection, I think, completely licenses the notion of free will. In a way beyond just, oh, this is what happened to this bacterium because it had lots of possibilities to go, and there was chaos in the mix, and it happened to go in this path or that path indeterminately. I think there's something beyond that with certain kinds of particles. So this paper really the key point of this paper, which is a path-integral formulation, is under what conditions would you be able to choose what to do next? And the conditions are actually quite simple. What happens is that when you tend to get very, very big, your inside becomes divorced or separated from the Markov blanket or the outside, your interface with the world, which means that now you don't have direct access to the way that you act upon the world. And remember, the whole point of the free energy principle is you can interpret, should you want to, the internal dynamics as representing or having beliefs about the causes of the sensory input that you're exposed to. But now your own actions are not available to you, but they can still affect your sensory input. So now they become causes. Now they become random variables that provide the support of the beliefs about the causes of your sensations. So now you've got a very different class of particle or system that effectively will now be inferring what its actions are. So now you've got something which is very distinct from a bacterium, which is itself distinct from a rock because the rock can't move, but very distinct from a bacterium, which now introduces an interesting, almost sort of, not paradox, but an interesting step up a ladder of sophistication in which the random variables that provide the support for your model of the world about which you have beliefs includes your own action. And at which point that means that you have to select the most likely action. At which point I think you do get at least a sort of minimal free willingness in the sense that you have to select one of many actions because you're inferring now, what am I doing? This is in machine learning known as planning as inference. So all we're saying is that certain big things get sufficiently large, we're talking sort of very large multicellular things, so that they actually represent their own actions and the consequences of those actions that have to be in the future. So there's necessarily a future pointing aspect to these kinds of implicit generative models that I think fully license free will of the sort that you were talking about. And all you need to do to show the maths of that is to assume that the thing is sufficiently big in order that you can remove a direct arrow from the active sector of your Markov blanket or boundary or holographic screen that would normally point to the internal states. So that's usually there for very simple systems and systems, so reaction diffusion systems or single cell organisms. But when you get big enough, you have to remove that, and at which point then this becomes effectively a random variable that goes into your generative model. And I think these kinds of systems are the sort that you're interested in. However, there is another condition for this mechanics that rests upon something called the expected free energy. Lemma variational free energy. We should actually also have another lemma here for expected free energy. My apologies. Oh yeah, expected free energy, and you can talk about this in terms of looking as if you're choosing those actions or paths into the future that minimize risk and ambiguity, or you can say that it means that I've become curious under constraints because I'm chasing expected information gain. But all this emerges from the simple assumption that you're sufficiently big to have conservative dynamics. So for any random, loosely coupled random dynamical system with a Markov blanket, this kind of behavior, this expected free energy, now describes the probability of the paths that your active states will take, the way that you act upon the world. And if this now becomes part of your generative model in these, if you like, more sparsely coupled systems, when your brain has a hierarchy, for example, then I think you are now fully in the game of oh, it's going to wait out. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting aspect from your perspective when asking what is the difference between bacteria and me and small particles. That again, largely is an emergent property of this scale-free aspect. That simply means that things at higher scales behave in a slightly different way from things at smaller scales. So you won't find, on this argument, things the size of pollen grains and bacteria would not have free will. They would certainly engage in active inference, and they could certainly have sort of Bayes optimal behavior, but they would not. Their internal states would not be. It wouldn't be as if they were encoding the future consequences of their own action for anything beyond the immediate present. Whereas when you get things as big as you and me, then one can start to argue that yes, there is planning in play. You can find internal states, if you like, that play the role of encoding the sufficient statistics of counterfactual beliefs about the future. And that brings me to the final point that yeah, what are we? Yeah, sorry, active. Oh, I see what I've done. Yeah, I've just got what's this one? Yeah, it's the same thing. Good. Okay, so we don't need that one. We can. You were asking right at the end, is there any, if in unpacking the kind of belief updating schemes or variational message passing or predictive coding schemes that would be that would manifest or realize this kind of inferential dynamics and sort of decision making and sense making. You were sort of highlighting predictive coding, and they are sort of the go-to kind of schemes and sets of differential equations that you would use if your generative model was of continuous states in the world. And I think that's perfectly apt for some low-level sensory motor behaviors. What I just wanted to put to you, though, is at some point you might want to consider discrete state space models where you're not using something called predictive coding or Bayesian filtering anymore. You're now using something, a very similar set of dynamics that you could actually write down in terms of a gradient flow with this Helmholtz decomposition on the variational free energy. But it's now read as belief propagation or variational message passing. So this is like predictive coding, but more apt to simulate belief updating under discrete state space models that have semantics. They have states of being that you can label with semantics. And I think this might be a more fruitful kind of belief updating scheme for simulations and numerical studies than predictive coding for some of your work. And I just picked out this example here, that when you think about agents that have generative models of the consequences of their action that can do this kind of planning, what you end up with is simulating neuronal representations of the future when you're doing your planning, that as time goes on become representations of the past. So you sort of have a sort of specious moment. Well, the speciousness of the present becomes explicit because now your representation is really as little paths or narratives or sequences of little futures from which you can then select, and then you can actually simulate it. And this is just a one figure. Which figure is it? It doesn't say. That's very irritating. That's very bad editorial. So this is just a little figure of a simulated mouse making choices, exerting her free will in terms of whether to go and search for instructional cues or go and get rewards, just to illustrate the kind of Bayesian mechanics and belief update you can get that has this mnemonic aspect. So I noticed you focused on short-term memory of sort of Jürgen Schmidhuber's to install the knowledge based upon the past. That I think is really important, but there's another aspect of mnemonics that can actually emerge in the present as long as you actually have a representation of the short-term future and the short-term past. So this would be the difference between short-term memory in you and me, psychologically speaking, iconic memory, working memory, which can be part of these discrete state space belief propagation schemes, versus the encoding of long-term memories in the sense of long-term potentiation, where that's sort of instilled into the connectivity, which is the long short-term memory instantiation in neural networks. So in my world, you distinguish between things that change very quickly, like states of the world, and having memories of states of the world in terms of prospective memories about what would happen if I did that, or what has just happened to me, versus a more procedural kind of memory, which is much more invariant and calls an experience-dependent learning. So you're asking, where is the uncertainty and where is the knowledge stored in biological systems like the brain? Well, it depends upon what you're asking about. If you're asking about where is the uncertainty about the current state of the world stored, either now or in 1 second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, then it's probably in the activity of neural populations encoding different states of being, and they look like receptive fields, and the encoding is in the activity of the populations that now form the sufficient statistics of a very simple probability distribution, which would be a multinomial or a Dirichlet distribution. Well, a multinomial distribution, categorical distribution. If you're asking about laws and contingencies and transitions and likelihood mappings that are characteristic of this kind of world or this environment, then they will be encoded in connection strengths, and you would learn those much more slowly. So the uncertainty will be encoded in the number of Dirichlet parameters that you've accumulated. So in these discrete state space formulations, you basically just, every time X is followed by Y, you put that into a tensor as a Dirichlet count. And if you're very uncertain, you'll only have about sort of 4 Dirichlet counts because you've only seen this thing 4 times. And when you renormalize to get the probability distribution, you get usually get a very uncertain probability distribution. So you normally start off with a prior concentration of 1 for, let's just say, I'm in this state, this happened, and I'm starting off, I've just been born, and a priori I'm going to assume I've seen every outcome once, and only one outcome can occur. So it's again, these are discrete state space models. But as I get older and wiser and more certain about the outcomes, if I keep seeing outcome 5 occur in this state, and I see it happening 80 times, I've now got 1 here and 81 counts here, and then 1 down here. So when I renormalize that to give me a sum to 1 probability distribution, then I've now got a very precise distribution, but it is also held confidently because I've got lots and lots of Dirichlet counts, as opposed to being very uncertain. I've just seen this thing 4 times. I got 1, 1, 1, 4, 1, 1, 1. And therefore, I've still got the most likely outcome, but I'm not very certain about it because of my Dirichlet counts. So in answer to your question, where would this be encoded in the brain? It will be encoded in the plastic potential of the connections that are basically implementing these tensors. So if you can update it very, very quickly, that usually means you're very uncertain about these laws, and your connection strength can be changed in an experience-dependent way. And people in neurobiology talk about experience-dependent plasticity. But if you're old and wise and confident, you can't really change that anymore. And it doesn't matter how many counterexamples you see, or even repetitions, you're not really going to change things very much because you're very certain. So in answering your question, you'd actually say uncertainty about what? Is it about mappings or parameters, or is it about this kind of state, about that kind of state? And it's likely that the biophysical instantiation of that may differ, and you can start to simulate that and try to ask empirical questions. Does this look like the results of an empirical study? If you wanted to read more about that kind of stuff, this is the process theory. So by process theory, what we meant here was how this kind of inference scheme would unpack as a biophysical process in a brain. So you may find some answers here that would take you away from short-term memory and more to a much simpler mathematical formulation. But I do repeat, it's only appropriate for discrete state space models. But sometimes those models are more apt for experimental studies. So that's in biological side, but no, it's not. It's in neural computation. Doesn't say, my apologies, it should. Oh, here, neural computation. That's good. Should you want to find it. And just the last point, which is a very recent development, and I'm putting this to you didactically as something I think you should look at when committing to a research program in the next few years. There is a way of putting, if you remember, we started off celebrating top-down and bottom-up causation by acknowledging that this can only happen in a scale-free, or at least, sorry, a scale invariant universe. If that's true, then your generative model should also install that scale-free aspect. So at one point you asked the question, does the anatomy of the brain have to be isomorphic, say in its hierarchical structure, with the anatomy of the world generating the sensations of the world? And the answer is absolutely yes. That you'll find that recapitulated throughout, before, I'm sure, Kant, during Kant, and after Kant. And I don't know what the right words are, but certainly the most explicit representation of that was in the early cybernetics movement, known as the good regulator theorem. So what that says is, if you want to engage actively and couple to your lived world, your eco-niche, the plant that you are controlling, you have to be a good model of that plant. You have to install the same architecture and the same causal structure as the plant you are controlling. And furthermore, you've got to have exactly the same degrees of freedom on the inside that are controllable on the relevant variables on the outside. That's known as the law of requisite variety, that comes from sort of 1940s, I think 50s, possibly earlier, early cybernetics treatments. That means, and there are lots of wonderful examples of this. I won't go through them, but just to answer your question in the affirmative, yes, absolutely. But in so answering, what you would also say, well, if it's the case that the structure of the world has to be installed into and recapitulated in some simplified, coarse-grained sense in a brain, the measuring object, the observer, then shouldn't that also show this scale-free aspect? Yes, it should. And what does that mean? It means that your brain must have be scale-free. It must be a network of belief updating, belief propagation that has scale invariance. And when a network is scale invariant, then it's called scale-free, and will have this sort of hierarchical aspect to it, where you get this slowing down of temporal scales as you get to deeper layers of the hierarchy that's standing now for the separation of temporal scales and spatial scales in the real world. I've just noticed what you've said here, that the architecture that inherits from this simple argument that the anatomy of the observing machine, the observer, the measuring device, has to recapitulate the causal structure of the thing out there that entails the bottom-up and top-down causation, has to have this hierarchical architecture. You are just talking about deep networks. So the deep in deep learning, the deep in deep convolutional networks, the deep in variation autoencoders, the deep in deep RL is just a statement of the fact you've got this hierarchical depth with the requisite effectively the requisite normalization group baked into your architecture. And that's why deep RL works. And that's why convolutional networks with a deep structure work, simply because they've installed or have this renormalizing aspect to them that allows for bottom-up and top-down causation in the message passing in the generative model that is trying to build the right kind of beliefs to explain the causes of sensations. And recently, this was made explicit in the context of these discrete state space models in this paper here. So if you wanted to read a sort of narrative account of the renormalization group, and also appointed some key references in machine learning and beyond, that are all trying to sort of motivate understanding good neural networks in machine learning through the lens of the renormalization group. You can find those references in this paper. There's a particularly good one written by an old friend of mine. I can't find it now, but anyway, it's highlighted here by saying that there's an excellent discussion of this in the machine learning literature, and I'm very sorry I can't find it because it sort of breathlessly introduces a number of scale-free generative models, renormalization groups. So these are very good references, but there was one I particularly liked. Anyway, never mind. I'm sure you'll find it if you're interested. And with that, I can stop sharing.
Mm-hmm.
You get messages from Teams here. So that's all I have to say in terms of my stream of consciousness in response to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much. I see. So I see the way to get into this interplay between abstract and less abstract variables that I'm always wondering about. So they are all, from this point of view, they are more or less all being represented by the same systems, more or less.
Yeah, in exactly a scale-free way. So exactly. The more concrete things are usually closer to the sensory interface, or exactly as you said. And then as you get deeper and deeper, you get these there's coarse graining, so you bring in multiple modalities, so you have multimodal representations, not only in space but also in time. So then you have narratives and episodes represented very, very deep, that sort of, you know, are domain general, and exactly the same. They are abstract, but they're still relevant in the sense of relevant variables in the context of the renormalization group, or the in the context of, you know, being scaling.
I see. Okay. That's very insightful. I'm gonna investigate. Yeah. Well, and thanks for all the references and all the amazing concepts. I'm gonna review the the recording of this. It is a privilege. I mean, to have received all these insights from you and from the rest of the guys, of course. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I have a lot to think from here.
Well, and you've got to finish it all by September, when your funding finishes.
My funding finishes in Christmas. It's a Christmas present for me.
Oh, sorry, yeah, not September, Christmas. Yes.
Yeah.
I was joking, because you're not going to do all that by Christmas, but hopefully you'll get an extension or another.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah. That's what I wish. My Christmas wish. Yes.
So I suspect now we are due for another round of applause for our speaker.
Oh, well, thanks.
And for Carl's wonderful answers, as usual. It's always a marathon, sprinted marathon, which is specific.
Is the way.
So yeah, so Gabriel, I will provide you the link after. Carl, I think you can stop the recording now.
Yeah.
I will provide you the link after it. I download it and I upload it to YouTube, and there will be like maybe a 24-hour delay. That's usually how it goes.
Okay,
and then,
perfect.
and then I'll send you the link, or Peter will send you